Children are emotionally immature. They are unaware of many of the dangers in the world, and they can be easily manipulated if they lack support or connection to their own immediate family. It's these very same traits that also make children so susceptible to being recruited as soldiers in various conflicts around the world. And now, thanks to technological advancements in weaponry, even a 6-year-old child can learn to operate and effectively use a wide range of small arms. Since 1999, the United Nations Security Council has passed several different resolutions designed to limit the use of child soldiers around the world. And these policies have been quite successful. The number of underage combatants in 1999 was estimated to be around 300,000. Today, it's closer to just a few thousand. But in countries like the Republic of Congo, Somalia, Syria, Yemen, and a few other places, children are still being used on the front lines. And so today's video is sort of a celebration of the entertainment industry's very strange double standard when it comes to showcasing child soldiers in their content. We'll also be taking a look at the actual consequences these child soldiers have from being exposed to combat at such a young age. We were first introduced to Anakin Skywalker in the original Star Wars film as Darth Vader, the enforcer of the Empire and Big Bad. But when George Lucas introduced the concept of the prequels to us, it was not something that anyone had called for, and it wasn't something that anyone knew they even wanted in the first place. The prequels was a space opera of epic proportions, and it showcased all of the strengths and weaknesses of George Lucas. And at the center of it all was a young Darth Vader, aka Anakin Skywalker. Born a slave, Anakin was a youth who was perhaps a bit mature for his age. Having an explosive implanted into your head so that you don't run away can do that to you. Anakin Skywalker was no stranger to danger. After teaming up with a bunch of completely irresponsible Jedi, Anakin Skywalker finds himself in the middle of a war zone during the blockade of Naboo. The young boy is told to hide inside of a cockpit of an advanced starfighter, which, surprise, suddenly goes into autopilot mode, sending the young boy into a crazy dogfight going on in orbit. Despite having no experience flying this starfighter, young Anakin was able to fly the ship into an enemy flagship and destroy it, disabling their entire ground army and effectively ending the conflict. I'm not exactly sure what kind of message George Lucas is trying to send to the audience here, but I'm sure it's not good. In our other YouTube channel, Generation Tech, we had a very close examination of Anakin Skywalker and concluded that he most likely has borderline personality disorder. Now, I'm not a doctor, but I routinely tell people in emergency situations that I am one. But it's clear that Anakin Skywalker would grow up tortured by his past trauma. Even though Anakin seems to enjoy flying a starship and doing spinning maneuvers at the time, the entire event was probably way too much for him to comprehend in a healthy way. As an adult, Anakin would start suffering from the psychological consequences of his childhood trauma. He began having nightmares and visions, major depression, hostility, and self-confidence issues. He eventually became abusive towards his wife and became increasingly violent to everyone around him. He would massacre an entire village of Tusken Raiders after they detained his mother, which led to her death. Anakin would eventually spiral out of control and began using and abusing the dark side of the Force. The year is 1989, and the United States has isolated itself from its former NATO allies. The Soviet Union is ready to pounce on the American heartland. In the small town Calumet, Colorado, a group of Soviet and Cuban paratroopers descend on the town and seize control of the area. They kill several civilians and law enforcement officers in the opening hours of their occupation. Jed Eckert and his brother Matt and their friends Robert, Danny, Daryl, and Otaro managed to evade Soviet forces by stockpiling hunting weapons and vanishing into the forest around the town. These high school students would begin carrying out guerrilla attacks on the occupation forces and named themselves after their local sports team mascot, the Wolverines. The Wolverines began suffering casualties as Soviet forces began seeing them as a serious threat. One Wolverine is even captured and fitted with a tracking device. He's discovered by his fellow freedom fighters and then executed. This completely erodes the morale of the Wolverines. Eventually, things get even worse for the Wolverines as they suffer more casualties. Ultimately, the entire fighting force is disbanded, and the survivors of the unit manage to reach free American territory just 40 miles away from their town. Now, their sacrifice serves as an inspiration for all American forces engaged in what would be known as World War III. But this entire story is kind of ridiculous. I mean, by 1984, the Soviet Union economy was only 1/5 the size of the United States, and it lacked the military capabilities to launch such a massive attack, especially on the American heartland. Furthermore, in real life, by 1989, the Soviet Union had already collapsed. Now, there is also another remake of Red Dawn, which replaced the Soviet soldiers with Chinese soldiers, but then after fearing censorship in China, the studio replaced those soldiers with North Korean soldiers in post. Which also doesn't really make all that much sense. Now, Red Dawn is a great movie, it's one of my favorites, but the message here is a little bit troubling because it is essentially trying to convince kids to create their own militias and take up weapons and fight some fictional occupational force that most likely will never arrive on America's shores. In the Enderverse, a huge alien threat known as the Formics emerge at the edge of our solar system and invades Earth, causing massive damage to the human civilization. Humanity barely survives this ordeal, which they later find out was only one of the Formic scouting missions. And so our reaction is to attack and launch a preemptive strike on the Formic homeworld and wipe them out once and for all. The Formics field a hive mind-controlled military force, something that is extremely hard to contend with. And so Earth gathers together its brightest and most capable children and places them in an orbital military academy known as Battle School. The children here are exceptional, and they're being groomed to lead humanity's future invasion army of Formic space. One child, Ender Wiggins, is not only incredibly brilliant, but also a natural-born leader. He is chosen to be the future commander of this entire mission. Unbeknownst to him and the rest of the children officers underneath his command, the last test they take before graduation wasn't a test at all, but the actual invasion. Ender Wiggins' command decisions have led to the deaths of countless human beings throughout this exercise, but also the complete destruction of the Formic race. Ender Wiggins is overcome by grief over what he has done. He doesn't fall for the short-term excitement and praise being thrown onto him by the adults running Battle School. He sees the long-term implications of his actions. History will remember him as an individual who committed genocide. Ender Wiggins, who was in telepathic communications with one of the last Formic queens, is directed to find the last remaining Formic queen egg. He would travel throughout the galaxy with this egg for the rest of his life, looking for a new home so that the Formic race could be rebirthed, putting humanity in very big danger, which is why you don't use child soldiers to make such important command decisions. John was just 6 years old when Dr. Catherine Halsey, a civilian scientist with the Naval Intelligence, selected the young boy for the Spartan II Super Soldier program. John had no say in the matter, and his parents weren't even informed. Instead, John was just taken one night when he was sleeping and replaced with a short-lived Flash clone, which died immediately after. It was a desperate act by a desperate Earth government seeking new solutions for the growing insurgency they were facing in the Outer Rim colonies. John would be one of 75 child candidates for the Spartan II project. He would undergo brutal and difficult military training that was usually reserved for adult candidates in the Special Forces. John was also taught in the various aspects of warfare and espionage. But by far the most difficult phase of John and the rest of the Spartan II's training would happen by the time they hit puberty. The Spartans would undergo a series of brutal bio-augmentation surgeries that essentially made them no longer humans, but super soldiers. These enhancements included the strengthening and enlargement of their skeletal structures, an increase in muscle mass and density, visual perception, and also an increase in cognitive speed. Unfortunately for the children, these surgeries were all extremely experimental and unproven, and ultimately 30 of the 75 Spartan IIs would die during this phase, and another 12 would be so physically deformed that they would no longer be able to fight. By the time the Spartan II program was completely activated, the human insurrectionist threat was no longer the biggest problem Earth faced. First contact had been made with the Covenant Alien Federation, and their continued assault on the human worlds presented an existential threat to humanity. Humanity's military forces, especially its navy, are completely outgunned by this new alien threat, but the Spartans proved to be extremely effective against the Covenants in individual combat on the ground. Despite their individual successes on the battlefield, though, ineffective leadership ends up getting the majority of the unit killed during the fall of Reach. John 117 would continue serving humanity in various wars against future threats. He would remain dedicated to the cause, but remained isolated from his fellow men and even the other non-augmented soldiers he served with. John 117's life is a noble sacrifice, but it was pushed onto him without consent at an extremely young age. The Spartan 2 program remains a big ethical nightmare for the Office of Naval Intelligence and the Earth government, but many individuals questioned whether these steps were indeed necessary to ensure the survival of humanity. The use of child soldiers in entertainment is troubling, but it's very clear why it's being done. Individuals like George Lucas know that a lot of children are going to be watching his movies, and so he wants to create characters that children can relate to. And these aren't just boring children who have teachers and parents who tell them not to do things. These are kids who are basically adults because they're flying around the galaxy in starships and killing things. Now, is this the message we want to be giving to our children, or are we just allowing these essentially corporations to prey on our kids with merchandise and other money-making potential? This is something we got to think about, because we obviously have a system of censorship that is based more on, I guess, financial concerns than actual ethical concerns. Anyway, guys, let me know in the comments section below what you think about all this. My name is Alan, reminding you that life is a movie, and you are the protagonist.